You know, when I finished the Fonz, I could not get hired really as an actor.
In the golden glow of the 1970s, few faces lit up American television like Henry Winkler's. As the Fonz on Happy Days, he wasn't just a character. He was a cultural phenomenon. The leather jacket, the slick hair, the effortless charm. It all came together to create an icon of rebellion and coolness that transcended the screen. But fame, as Henry would learn, can be a double-edged blade, one that glitters brightly before it cuts deep. When Happy Days ended, the applause faded faster than he ever imagined. Casting directors stopped calling. Audiences who once adored him now looked through him, as if he were a relic from another era. Behind his calm smile and self-deprecating humor, Henry Winkler was unraveling, quietly, painfully. The same Hollywood that once crowned him king was now treating him like a man who'd overstayed his welcome. NHE would later admit that those years were marked by something more sinister than simple career decline, betrayal. And not from strangers, but from those who had stood beside him, laughed with him, and shared the very stage that made him a star. Henry's charm was his shield, but it couldn't protect him from what he called the kindness that killed. It wasn't open hostility that destroyed him. It was the slow, silent corrosion of trust. Smiles that concealed envy, compliments laced with poison. Friends who learned to outshine him by pretending not to compete. NHE often reflected on one truth. In Hollywood, no one stabs you in the back anymore. They just hug you a little too tight. And perhaps no one embodied that truth more than Ron Howard. To the world, Ron was the perfect colleague, the boyish, soft-spoken director-to-be, admired for his humility. But to Henry, he became something else entirely, a quiet saboteur, a master of understated dominance. Ron didn't need to shout or outact anyone. He simply stood still, letting his silence become gravitas while Henry's every line, every gesture, was interpreted as overcompensation. What Henry saw as passion, producers began to label too much. What Ron did effortlessly, Henry did urgently, and the industry rewarded calm over charisma. In interviews years later, Henry spoke cautiously about it, never naming Ron outright, but describing him as someone whose decency became a weapon. He meant it not cruelly, but with the weary understanding of a man who realized too late that Hollywood doesn't reward intensity. It rewards control. NBY. The early 1980s, Henry's star had dimmed. He'd become the man no one wanted to cast, the actor everyone said was too recognizable, too Fonzie, or simply too much. But beneath those polite rejections, Henry sensed something darker, an unspoken relief among his peers that the once dominant Fonz had finally been dethroned. NHE would smile in interviews, still the charming professional, saying he was grateful for the memories. But when the cameras turned off, he sat alone with that quiet question that haunts every fallen star. Was it my fault, or did they make sure I disappeared? NTHE truth, Henry would later confess, was somewhere in between. The industry that built him also buried him, and the people who called him family were the first to forget his name. Hollywood didn't exile Henry Winkler with scandal or disgrace. It did something colder. It simply looked away. And in that silence, more than fame, more than failure, Henry found his first real heartbreak. As the curtain of Happy Days fell, Henry Winkler's public smile never faltered. He shook hands, gave farewell interviews, and spoke of new horizons. But behind that confident grin, a storm was brewing. The kind of silent humiliation that doesn't make headlines but eats away at the soul. It began with the shift in energy on set, subtle at first, then suffocating. The network had grown restless. Ratings had started to dip, and suddenly, everyone was searching for a way to freshen things up. That's when the studio introduced a new name, Scott Baio, a young, clean-cut actor with perfect teeth and a marketable smile. And at first, Henry welcomed him like a little brother. He reminded me of myself when I started, Henry later said, his voice tinged with bittersweet reflection. But it didn't take long for him to notice how the air around Baio changed whenever the producers entered the room. Compliments that once belonged to Henry now floated toward the newcomer. Jokes written for the Fonz were subtly reassigned to Chachi. And soon, magazine covers that once carried Winkler's face now bore Baio's. It wasn't just replacement, it was erasure disguised as evolution. Henry knew it, but he couldn't fight it. To the studio, Bio represented the new America, youthful, obedient, safe. Where Winkler's Feuds had once embodied rebellion, Bio's Chachi offered reassurance. The edge was gone, the fire dimmed, and the show that had once defined coolness now felt like a commercial for conformity. Still, Henry played along. He told himself it was just the natural order of things. Every show evolves. But when fans began to shout, "We love Chachi," instead of "Aye, Feuds," during live tapings, something inside him cracked. The applause that had once lifted him now felt like a eulogy. And then came Tom Bosley, the fatherly anchor of the show, known to the public as America's Dad. To Henry, he was both mentor and mystery, a man who seemed kind, yet somehow always left him feeling smaller. Bosley never raised his voice, never insulted Henry outright. His power was quieter, hidden in words wrapped in wisdom. "Henry, you don't need to try so hard," Bosley once told him during rehearsal. Sometimes less is more. And on the surface, it sounded like advice, but to Henry, it felt like a dagger cloaked in silk. Don't try so hard, as if his passion, his life's fire, was now seen as desperation. From that day, he started second-guessing himself. Every movement, every line delivery, every smile, he wondered if he was being too much. NTHE irony wasn't lost on him. The very energy that made him a star was now the reason he was fading. NHE would later admit that Bosley's words haunted him more than any review or headline. They made him doubt his instincts, his timing, his place in the room. He began shrinking himself, dimming his own light in hopes of blending in, not realizing that this very act was what made him invisible. And as the show pressed on, so did the quiet tension. Ron Howard was now being courted by studios for directing gigs. Baio had his own spin-off in the works. Bosley was adored by critics. And Henry? He was still there, loyal, professional, clinging to a role that was no longer his. NBUT, what hurt the most wasn't losing fame. It was realizing that the same people who once cheered his success now seemed relieved by his decline. Hollywood loves an underdog, but it loves a downfall even more. "Knopf's set," whispers began to spread. "Henry's difficult. Henry's intense. He's not as easy to work with as Ron." None of it was true, but truth rarely matters in show business. Once a narrative begins, it becomes gospel. And for the first time, Henry saw himself not as the star of Happy Days, but as its ghost. A man watching his legacy be rewritten in real time by people who smiled as they did it. NHE would later describe it best in one sentence. Hollywood doesn't break your heart all at once. It does it slowly, one polite betrayal at a time. When Happy Days finally ended, Henry Winkler imagined freedom, the chance to reinvent himself, to step beyond the leather jacket that had defined his youth. He dreamed of serious roles, dramatic scripts, maybe even film work that could prove he was more than a catchphrase. But Hollywood had other plans. NTHE moment the cameras stopped rolling, the phone stopped ringing. The same executives who had once begged for his presence now acted as if they didn't remember his name. Every audition felt colder. Every "we'll call you" sounded emptier. In a city that worships the next big thing, Henry had become yesterday's news, a man trapped in the shadow of his own success. NHE began to feel it in his bones, the cruel irony of fame. The world had loved the Feuds, not Henry Winkler. And once the character was gone, so was their affection. But even as he tried to move forward, he found himself haunted by familiar faces, people who had shared his journey and now stood among his quiet tormentors. And one of them was John Ritter. To the public, Ritter was the lovable, goofy everyman from Three's Company. But to Henry, he represented something more painful, a reflection of what Hollywood now wanted. Subtlety, softness, restraint. Ritter's performances were being praised as transformative, while Henry's emotional style was being labeled dated. Each awards ceremony was like salt in the wound. Ritter's name was called again and again, and Henry, sitting in the audience, forced a smile for the cameras. He applauded politely, his palms stinging with quiet envy. He didn't hate Ritter. He admired him deeply, but he couldn't ignore the sting of being forgotten while others soared. There's a certain kind of loneliness that only actors understand, when you're watching someone else live the life you were promised. Henry knew it too well. He'd walk into restaurants and overhear whispers, people saying things like, "That's the guy who used to play the Fonz." Used to. Two words that crushed him more than any insult ever could. As months turned into years, Henry's self-belief began to fracture. He started questioning his worth, wondering if his career had been a fluke. That's when he crossed paths with Danny Bonaduce, the brash, outspoken former child star from the Partridge Family. Bonaduce was Hollywood's wild child, reckless, brutally honest, and always chasing attention. And at a charity event in Los Angeles, Henry approached him with his usual warmth. But instead of camaraderie, he got cruelty. "You're past it, man," Bonaduce sneered. "Nobody cares about the Fonz anymore." N.T. Ho's words hit Henry like a slap. It wasn't just an insult. It was confirmation of every private fear he'd buried. He laughed it off in public, pretending not to care. But that night, back home, he couldn't sleep. He replayed the moment again and again, that smirk, that tone, and something inside him hardened. From that day, Henry began keeping what he later called the list, not on paper, but in his mind. A quiet record of every betrayal, every humiliation, every name that had cut him down with a smile. It wasn't revenge he wanted, it was clarity, a reminder of who had helped him fall when he was already slipping. And even among his Happy Days family, the cracks deepened. Donnie Most, who played the lovable Ralph Malph, had once been a close friend. But during one taping, Donnie improvised a slapstick stunt, a pratfall that accidentally stole the spotlight from Henry's emotional monologue. The audience roared with laughter, and the scene was ruined. Henry didn't explode. He didn't need to. The following week, Donnie's role was quietly reduced. Scenes were cut. Screen time vanished. No one spoke of it, but everyone understood. Henry had learned the Hollywood way of settling scores, silently, strategically, and without a trace. Years later, Henry would look back on that era with a strange mixture of sadness and steel. "I wasn't angry," he said in an interview. "I was educated." Because that's what Hollywood does. It teaches you to smile while you bleed, to applaud the people who replaced you, and to pretend you're fine when you're quietly fading. And Henry Winkler, the man once known for his unstoppable confidence, had learned the hardest lesson of all. In a world built on applause, silence is the cruelest punishment. By the mid-1980s, Henry Winkler had become a ghost of the man who once electrified America. To the outside world, he was still smiling, attending charity events, appearing on talk shows, pretending everything was fine. But behind that smile lived a man quietly unraveling, piece by piece. Hollywood had a way of disguising cruelty in politeness, and Henry was learning to read its language. Every "we love your work" meant "we're done with you." Every "we'll find something soon" meant "we already replaced you." He'd walk into casting rooms only to watch the flicker of recognition fade from the director's eyes. That moment when they realized he was that guy, the actor who used to be cool. NBUT, the final blow didn't come from an executive or a critic. It came from someone he never expected, Alan Thicke. It was supposed to be simple, a light-hearted anti-drug PSA, filmed for kids, something wholesome and easy. Henry had agreed immediately, thinking it would be a small chance to give back, to remind people of the warmth behind the Fonz. The cameras rolled. The children laughed. The message was clear. But during one take, Thicke stopped him mid-sentence. "Henry," he said, smiling for the crew, "maybe try it with a little less drama." NTHE words stung, but Henry nodded, adjusting his tone. They tried again. And again, Thicke interrupted. "No, don't act it, Henry. Just say it." NTHE children giggled. The crew exchanged glances. And in that single humiliating moment, Henry felt something he hadn't felt since the early days of Happy Days. Small. It wasn't about the PSA. It was about respect, or the lack of it. Thicke had reduced him to a caricature of his former self in front of an audience that once adored him. Henry smiled through it, delivered the line again, but something broke inside. He went home that night and didn't speak for hours. That's when he began to realize that Hollywood doesn't kill legends. It lets them die in plain sight. And everywhere he went, he saw it. The quiet decline of actors who'd once been untouchable. Some turned to bitterness, some to alcohol, others to complete anonymity. Henry refused to crumble. But he carried a private grief, the grief of being remembered for a role instead of a life. NHE started withdrawing. The parties stopped. The premieres became rare. He focused on his family, his children, anything that didn't involve the fickle glare of fame. But even then, the ghosts of happy days lingered. Tom Bosley's voice echoed in his head. Sometimes less is more. The phrase that once felt like a subtle insult now sounded like a prophecy. Maybe he had been too much. Maybe passion really was a liability in a business built on control. NHE looked at Ron Howard, now a respected director, winning awards and praise for his humility. The press hailed Ron as the true genius behind the scenes, the calm center of happy days. And Henry? He was a nostalgic talking point, a trivia answer on late-night TV. NBUT, beneath the envy, was something darker, resentment wrapped in respect. He admired Ron's success, but couldn't shake the feeling that Ron had built it on the quiet erasure of their shared past. Henry had been the energy, the chaos, the spark that made the show unforgettable. Yet it was Ron's stillness that Hollywood now praised as art. NHE once said in an interview years later, "Ron and I had two different languages. Mine was fire, his was silence. Hollywood preferred his." NTHAT single line captured everything. Henry didn't lose to talent, he lost to perception. In an industry where image outweighs truth, the man who burns brightest is often the first to burn out. And yet, through all of it, the humiliation, the fading fame, the whispered pity, Henry never stopped working. He started producing, mentoring young talent, slowly rebuilding his place behind the camera. NBUT, even as he reinvented himself, he carried a secret burden, a list of names etched into memory, not out of hate, but out of heartbreak. Ron Howard, Scott Baio, Tom Bosley, John Ritter, Danny Bonaduce, Donnie Most, Alan Thicke. Each one had shaped his fall in a different way. Each one had taken a piece of the man who once defined coolness for a generation. Henry Winkler's story was no longer about happy days. It was about survival in a town where nice people do the cruelest things, and where silence, not scandal, is the weapon that finishes you. In the stillness of his home, long after happy days had become a memory, Henry Winkler began to live a life few ever saw. A life not of fame, but of quiet despair. The applause was gone, the cameras were silent, and in their absence, he met the most haunting version of himself. NFOR years. Henry had lived by the rhythm of recognition, the laughter of the audience, the calls from producers, the lights that framed his face in gold. Without them, the world seemed unbearably quiet. He tried to fill the silence with projects, voice work, and appearances, but nothing could mask the ache of invisibility. NHE once said, "When the spotlight turns off, you hear every doubt you've ever ignored." And the doubts came loud. NWA, is he ever truly talented? Or had he just been lucky? Did the world love Henry Winkler, or had it only ever loved the Fonz? Every smile he gave to fans began to feel like an echo of something that no longer belonged to him. The man who once defined confidence now couldn't find any. Worse, the very people who could have reassured him, his old castmates, were either gone, thriving, or uninterested. Ron Howard was directing Oscar-winning films. John Ritter was collecting awards. Scott Baio was still being called the next big thing. And Henry? He was the man Hollywood politely forgot. NHE kept a brave face in interviews. Still charming, still kind. But close friends recall how he would pause between answers, as if searching for the right emotion to hide behind. He wasn't bitter, not yet, but he was deeply wounded. NTHE wound deepened when John Ritter, the man whose rise had mirrored his fall, died suddenly in 2003. Henry attended the funeral quietly, sitting in the back, almost unseen. As the eulogies played, something inside him broke. Not in anger, but in regret. NHE realized he had spent years envying a man he had never truly known. Ritter's death reminded him of the fragility of fame, of how both of them had been victims of the same system that builds you up only to tear you down. The difference was that Ritter had learned to forgive Hollywood. Henry hadn't. And after that, something in him shifted. NHE stopped keeping the list. He stopped replaying the insults, the betrayals, the humiliations. because he finally understood that the real battle had never been against his co-stars or producers. It had been against the voice inside him whispering, "You're not enough anymore." Still, the pain didn't vanish overnight. There were moments when old bitterness returned, like when he saw Alan Thicke hosting yet another primetime special, his confidence filling the room like a reminder of that humiliating PSA. Or when fans asked him if he still owned the jacket, as if that leather relic was all that remained of his identity. NHE smiled each time, but those smiles came at a cost. Behind them was a man still trying to reconcile the difference between being famous and being fulfilled. And then, one evening, while flipping through television channels, he came across a rerun of Happy Days. He watched himself, young, vibrant, unstoppable, and felt something he hadn't felt in years: compassion. For the first time, he didn't see a character. He saw a man doing his best to stay afloat in a sea of expectations. It was that moment, he later said, when he stopped hating his past and started forgiving it. NHE began mentoring young actors, not out of nostalgia, but out of purpose. He taught them what Hollywood never taught him: how to stay human when fame tries to turn you into a brand. When people asked him how he survived being forgotten, he smiled softly and said, "By remembering that the person inside me is bigger than the character I played." And it wasn't the triumphant comeback Hollywood loves to glorify. There was no red carpet, no big redemption speech. It was quieter, but infinitely more powerful. Because in that stillness, Henry Winkler found what fame had stolen from him decades earlier: peace. By the time Henry Winkler turned 70, the industry that once discarded him began to whisper his name again, not with pity this time, but with reverence. It was as if the world had finally caught up to the man it had so easily left behind. For decades, he'd been the symbol of lost stardom, a relic of a bygone era. But now, the same voice that once carried Fonzie's swagger had found something far richer: wisdom. His face, older and lined, carried the weight of humility and grace, and his performances began to reflect that depth. NNTHE revival didn't come overnight. It began quietly, with guest roles that reminded audiences of his charm. But it wasn't until his role as Gene Cousineau in HBO's Barry that the world finally stopped and took notice. Here was Henry Winkler, no longer hiding behind leather jackets or nostalgia, but bearing his soul in a raw, unforgettable performance. The industry that once mocked him now called him brilliant. His portrayal was layered, tragic, funny, and profoundly human, the culmination of a lifetime spent learning what it means to fall and rise again. And when he walked up to the stage to receive his first Emmy Award in 2018, the audience erupted into a standing ovation. Decades of silence shattered in an instant. It wasn't just applause for his work. It was a collective apology from an industry that had finally realized its mistake. As he held the trophy, his hands trembling, his voice cracked with emotion. "If you stay at the table long enough," he said, "the chips will come to you." NNTHAT line, so simple yet profound, summed up everything he had endured: the rejection, the jealousy, the years of being typecast, the quiet despair. Henry had stayed. He hadn't quit when the world forgot him. And that endurance had finally turned into triumph. NNBUT behind that glittering moment was something even more powerful: reconciliation. And Henry began reaching out to old friends and co-stars. He called Ron Howard. He even spoke kindly of those who had once treated him with disdain. To him, forgiveness wasn't weakness anymore. It was liberation. In interviews, he often said that carrying anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It was a lesson hard learned, but one that changed him completely. NNHE became known not just as an actor, but as a mentor, a storyteller, and a survivor. Young artists looked up to him, not because of who he had been, but because of what he had become. Proof that kindness, even when unreturned, is still strength. NTHE. Same man who once feared irrelevance now spent his days inspiring others to embrace their own imperfections. At fan conventions, people who grew up watching Happy Days would approach him with tears in their eyes, thanking him for the joy he brought them. He no longer flinched when they mentioned the Fonz. Instead, he smiled, grateful that the role which once trapped him had also kept his spirit alive in the hearts of millions. In one particularly moving interview, Henry said, "I used to think success was being seen. Now I know it's being remembered with love." And perhaps that's what made his late-life resurgence so special. It wasn't about fame anymore. It was about closure, and an The man who once stood in the shadows of resentment now walked in the light of gratitude. He had become a living testament to endurance, proof that even when Hollywood closes its doors, there's always a window left open for those who refuse to stop believing. Henry Winkler didn't just reclaim his career. He rewrote the meaning of success itself. In the quiet hours before dawn, Henry Winkler often sits by his kitchen window, a mug of tea in his hands, watching the first light spill over the city that once chewed him up and spat him out. The Hollywood hills, bathed in gold, seem almost peaceful now, as if they too have grown older, softer, wiser. The no longer measures his worth in roles, ratings, or applause. The boy who once dreamed of fame, the man who once demanded validation, has finally made peace with silence. It's a silence that no longer feels empty. It feels earned. There was a time when every reflection in a studio mirror felt like an accusation. You peaked too soon. You lost your edge. You'll never be relevant again. But now, those same mirrors reflect a man who survived it all. Not unscathed, but unbroken. When people meet Henry today, they often say the same thing. You haven't changed. The smiles politely. But the truth is, he's changed completely. The man who once lived for the camera has learned to live without it. And yet, Hollywood, in its strange, cyclical way, never truly lets go of its old flames. Over the years, he has become something unexpected. A beloved, elder statesman of television. Producers, once eager to replace him, now seek his wisdom. Young stars sit with him between takes, asking how to survive in an industry that devours its own. The tells them stories, not the glamorous ones, but the ones filled with heartbreak, silence, and humility. He tells them about envy, about the poison of comparison, about the day he realized that being the Fonz was both a blessing and a curse. Most of all, he tells them about forgiveness, that elusive gift he once withheld from others and from himself. There's a quiet beauty in how he speaks of the people who hurt him now. Ron Howard, once the silent rival, is now described as a man who saw things differently. Tom Bosley, whose soft-spoken cruelty left scars, is remembered as a teacher in disguise. The same faces that once represented your downfall can, in time, become chapters in your resurrection. In recent years, Henry has taken to writing children's books, gentle, humorous stories about resilience and self-acceptance. In them, you can hear echoes of his own life. A man learning, over and over again, that kindness always outlasts cruelty. He's also become a powerful advocate for dyslexia awareness, opening up about the struggles he once hid out of shame. For decades, he believed his reading difficulty made him less than, another quiet wound he carried through his career. But now, standing before children who share his struggle, he tells them the truth. You are not stupid. You are not broken. You just learn differently. And in those words, you can hear the echo of every pain he's ever endured, transformed into purpose. Henry Winkler's story is no longer about betrayal or jealousy or the slow death of fame. It's about transcendence. It's about the man who refused to become bitter, who let grace do what revenge never could. When he steps onto a set today, the crew still greets him with warmth. Not because he's the Fonz, but because he's Henry, the kindest man in the room, the one who never forgot what it felt like to be forgotten. In the end, he doesn't need Hollywood's validation anymore. He found something purer, quieter, and infinitely more lasting: peace. As the sun rises over Los Angeles, he takes one last sip of tea, and a faint smile crosses his face. He once said, "If you're lucky enough to do what you love, that's success. If you're still doing it 50 years later, that's a miracle." And perhaps that's the perfect final truth of Henry Winkler's journey, that in an industry obsessed with youth, he aged into something far rarer than fame. He became timeless.